Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and we are thrilled with this turnout for this presentation. Really glad to have you here. I want to tell you a little bit about Clark. Clark has had a lifelong interest in world history and other cultures. He's a native of Atlanta, but has visited 66 countries and all 7 continents. He's been researching and writing a comprehensive history of Sandy Springs, working on that. He also has been working on some video productions, Southern Heritage video productions. And he founded the Sandy Springs Historic Preservation Society, received Volunteer of the Year Award for Historic Preservation from Sandy Springs in 2012, and the Spirit of Sandy Springs Award from the Sandy Springs Society in 2013. And I met Clark when I was working a little, helping with some Sandy Springs history over at Heritage Sandy Springs. That's how I know him, and I've seen his presentation on Sandy Springs history before. So we are really thrilled to have him here to talk with us today. Clark Otten, thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Thanks, everybody, for coming out on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I appreciate everybody showing up. She makes me sound like a little more than I really am. I'm just a local boy who's turned out to be another old man who's always talking about the past. So,
Did you remember it better than most of it?
no, actually, I just look at my screen to see, what am I supposed to say next? Thanks. We're going to jump right in here. Can everybody hear me in the back okay?
No. Come forward.
Come forward. All right, how's that? Because I have to be here and I can do it like that. Okay, I'll try my best.
Turn down cell phones.
Turn off cell phones. Fire exits that way. Any unused lottery tickets right here.
Do we need this off now?
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt.
That's not the right
I think you have to, just punch hard.
Okay.
There we go. So we're off on the train. This train is actually down in Tifton, Georgia, at Agwarama. If any of you've ever been down there, you're probably familiar with it. If not, I highly recommend visiting Agwarama. It's a fascinating facility. But before we get too carried away talking about railroads, I want to talk about the term highway. What does the word highway mean? I mean, all of us know the modern use of the word, big road going somewhere. But it actually has a history behind it, a highway, or in Old English, high road, high street. And it literally means what its name says. There's 2 theories of how it came to be. One of them is from the old Roman roads, which were built up from the surrounding land. You see it in cross profile here, so that the water would drain off of them, and they were the high road through the swamps. That's one theory of where that term comes from. Another one, and I like this one a little better, comes from natives traveling on foot. It could be natives anywhere, but obviously here we're talking about Native Americans who are traveling on foot for long distances. The early native populations that lived here would migrate from the Piedmont area in the mountains down to the coastal plains and back every year. So they were walking by foot, carrying everything they needed, because we didn't have beasts of burden until DeSoto brought horses back into the United States in the 1400s. The actual Native American horses disappeared about 8,000 BC. So you had to walk a long ways. Well, here's this kind of topographical representation of land. And if you're right here on this ridge line, and you want to get to over here on this ridge line, well, you got 2 choices. You can take the short route, which is climb down the valley, climb back up the other side, carrying everything that you've got. Or you could just follow the ridge line around this side. It's a longer route, but it's much more level. You won't have to ford any streams. You won't have to fight keeping your balance going uphill and downhill. So most natives, regardless of where they're from in the early periods, would pick the high route to travel from one spot to another to make it easier. Well, the natives here, of course, had done that, and their paths predated the the European immigration to the United States. And one of the early maps that early trails that came through this area was called the Hightower Trail. And it's shown here on the 1795 map of Georgia, which has a much different shape at that point. And we are right here about where this star is. How do we know that? Because here's the trail and here's the Chattahoochee River. So we know it crosses over here in Sandy Springs close by. So we can identify ourselves on this map. This trail was here when the first natives landed in Americas. When the first Europeans landed in the Americas. And it was a trading trail for the natives. And then as the British populated South Carolina, they started traveling this trail, taking goods into the Indian lands and trading and setting up outposts. That was known as the Hightower Trail. It went basically from over here about Lake Oconee, up past Stone Mountain, all the way up to Rozell, and then on beyond to the Etowah Mounds. Hightower is probably just a Anglicization of Etowah, which is the name of the village up at this end of it. There was also mounds down here around Lake Oconee, but when the dam was built for Lake Oconee, those mounds were flooded, and they're, of course, gone for today. Various little balloons you see along here are all different Indian settlements. This section was known quite often as the Rockbridge Trail because there was a stone bridge across the Yellow River. Our area was known as the Hightower Trail, and interestingly enough, as you come back out here, even today, you'll find Hightower Road. All right? And I think maybe some of you are familiar with this, Jim Perkins' map of the Hightower Trail. And one of the things that confuses people about this trail is it crossed the river at the Shallowford crossing. And people tend to blur those two terms, the Shallowford crossing and the Hightower Trail. But in fact, there was a second trail that intersected this one called the Shallowford Trail. This trail ended basically near the Northridge exit of 400. It went down through past Perimeter Mall, through what we call Cross Keys, or Old Cross Keys if you want to be specific, on down all the way through Decatur. Claremont Road is part of the Shallowford Trail, through the heart of Decatur, all the way down to South Georgia to around Lake Jackson, an area known as Indian Springs. These two trails intersected right up here again at the Northridge exit. You've got the Hightower and the Shallowford Trail. And we are right down here, right where we are. That is the Shallowford Trail out here in front of the house, now called Chamblee Dunwoody. Here we see an 1866 map. Here's the river, and you'll see this road coming this way and another one going this way. Well, these roads are just where the early settlers took over Indian trails. This is the Hightower Trail, and there's the Shallowford Trail. And those two trails intersected, like I say, by Northridge exit. How many of you remember Obadiah Copeland's well that was on Chamblee Dunwoody Road? That's because he founded a trading post and established his home right there where the two trails intersected. Now, once again, talking about highways, take a look at Mount Vernon, which was probably also at one time an Indian trail. This is a shot from Google Earth where I've exaggerated the terrain, but you can see how it slopes down away from the road as you go along. And if you drive down it, you know the road's going down land's going down like this on both sides. The same thing with Chamblee Dunwoody. Here's Dunwoody Village down here at the bottom. We come this way, and you see the land slopes away from both sides, and we're right here on the Bannister Farm. So these highways were the sought-after passage, whether you were Native Americans or settlers or later trains. Here we see what was the Peachtree Trail going off through Chamblee. Again, land sloping down either side. And of course, Peachtree Road, the MARTA, and the railroad still go down that ridge line. In the South, getting products to the market was a bit of a problem. If you were not near a river port or not near a railroad terminal, you couldn't effectively market your produce very far. This was especially true in our area because we weren't close to either one. And so you can see the big effort somebody made to move product. This is an 1848 map of Georgia, and it shows the early railroads. These are some of the first railroads connecting the ports of the Savannah River, which is basically Augusta and Savannah. Here's the river up through here, and up to Athens. These were our first railroads. The Rozell Manufacturing Company wanted to tap into this. Now here's a detail of this map, and we see Marietta right here. We see Decatur right there. What's missing? Atlanta. Atlanta doesn't even exist yet, so both of these predate Atlanta. All right, here's the end of that railroad line in Marietta, bringing cotton to the railroad head. By 1850, Georgia had more miles of railroad than any other southern state. And while this helped the state to grow, it also made us a target during the Civil War. The Rozell Mills in 1853 employed over 500 people, developed a lot of product, and they wanted to get it to market. And before even the bridge was built, they went across the bridge that we call Holcomb Bridge today to get products into Norcross where they could get on a railroad, or they went the other way to Marietta out what we call 120 to get their products there, but they didn't have a route directly south. All right? After 10 years of talking about building a railroad, which you can follow in their minutes, they finally got a charter to start one in 1863 from the state, and they started grading a bed from Rozell to Atlanta during the war. Now they used slave labor at that point. They actually bought slaves to start grading that passage. In the meantime, the Rozell Mills built the first Rozell Road Bridge. Now, of course, this was destroyed during the Civil War, and then Mr. Dunwoody replaced the bridge after the war. The Rozell Railroad is marked as an unfinished railroad on these Union maps coming down through there. The original plans would have had it connect down to roughly where the MARTA station is in Brookhaven. Well, on July 9th, 1864, when McPherson's troops reached Rozell, they crossed at the Shallowford crossing, that same Indian crossing point, because the bridge had been burned, came to the south side of the river and camped and rested, resupplied, and got ready for the assault on Atlanta. And when they moved out, they went down this railroad line, this railroad bed. Still no railroad, just a nicely graded avenue headed towards Atlanta. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the war having destroyed so many railroads all through the state, bringing much of the state to its knees. But of course, this didn't happen to the Rozell Railroad because it hadn't been built yet. Just the bed had been graded. Well, after the war, while others worked on repairing the railroads, the Rozell Railroad finally got on its feet and started to begin work on the actual rails in 1875. Now, while the initial bed grading had been done by slave labor, the actual building of the railroad was done with convict labor. Now, this practice was so common, here's a postcard showing convicts building a railroad. I mean, it was a very common occurrence. People were arrested on vague charges like vagrancy and put to work for the state at a profit. New form of slavery, if you will. And one of the problems this created was it took jobs away from people who were living in an area, because these people were working for free, and somebody who might have worked on a road or some other project has been displaced by these convicts. It's kind of an interesting picture. You see rolling wagons, almost like circus wagons, that they would move convicts from project to project, like building this railroad. And again, this railroad went right down in front of the house. Right after the Union troops went right down in front of this house. So we got Indians, we got armies, and now we're going to have a railroad coming this way. There were 2 convict camps nearby in Sandy Springs, one near Morgan Falls later on, and one near Hammond and Rozell roads that helped build the roads and railroads of this area. And right or wrong, the railroads would never have recovered as fast as they did had it not been for convict labor. And the Rozell Railroad certainly had no qualms about using convicts for their project. The Rozell Railroad actually began operating on a narrow gauge track on 9/11, interesting date, 9/11, 1881. And the first engine is recorded to be an 060. Now, when they talk about numbers and an engine, they're counting the wheels. How many wheels might be in the front, how many driving wheels there are, and then how many wheels might be trailing behind under the cab. In this case, we've got an 030, right, because you have 3 driving wheels. Well, our first one was an this is an 060, 3 on this side, 3 on the other. So this is an 060, probably what the first one here looked like, but as far as I've been able to find, there are no pictures of the original engine. The train engineer was named Isaac Roberts, and Ike owned about 600 acres just south of the river near the bridge in Rozell. And this is the train depot in the 1800s, just across from his house. Now, he built the house across from the depot after the train had been started. And here's a picture of his house from, I think, about the 1970s. And note the horse and buggy. There's not a lot of roads here yet. The railroad is a real godsend for moving things any real distance. You've got horse and buggies, but you don't have much of a road system. And what is muddy ruts. Cars weren't part of our scene at this point. Here's a picture of Ike. Ike started as a young man as a laborer building railroads, then became a wood fetcher, and eventually built his way up till he became the engineer of the Rozell Railroad. He was the only engineer throughout its entire existence.
Is Roberts Road named after him?
It is, in fact, and the Roberts house is still on Roberts Drive. If you're coming off of Rozell Road, it will be the second house on the left-hand side. Looking up the driveway, this is much as what it looks like today. Again, a 70s picture. This, although it's black and white to match the style, this is a recent picture. Unfortunately, it's gotten a little overgrown and it's kind of hard to see the house at this point.
Good question.
Yes?
Was it always called Roberts Drive, or was it had another name first and then, you know?
As far as I know, it's always been called Roberts. Now, if you, again, turn off of Rozell Road onto Roberts, you pass this little strange hill almost immediately on your right-hand side. I don't know if any of you have ever noticed it, but it is sort of like, if you look at terrain, it's like, well, what's that about? Well, that is actually the beginning of what would be a trestle bridge across the Chattahoochee. The original plan was for the train to go all the way into Rozell. And this is a built-up roadbed for the train. The train would be up here, and the trestles would have started right here going across the river. If you're up on top, you can see right how the train would go straight across this way. And what you're seeing here is the telephone wires. That's how high up this is built. Right? And on the far side of the river, there's a similar mound. As you go up the hill into Rozell, if you look off to the right in the fall, you can see a little bed being built out that way. They never had the money to build that trestle, so this train started on the south side of the river. Now, you can see remnants of this railroad in a 1934 Department of Agriculture aerial photography of the area. Here's the Chattahoochee River, here's the Rozell Road Bridge, and here's the railroad, hit a button, here's the railroad coming up the hill away from the river. And if we zoom in on the same thing, it gets a little blurry, but you can see the train station right here and the Roberts house right here. The original engine was replaced at some point, and I've read various different dates attributed to when that happened, so who knows which one's exactly accurate, but they replaced it with a 442. You've got 4 small wheels, 4 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. Now, all of these engines were referred to as the buck. So when we talk about the buck, it was really more than one train. This image is at the Chambly station, which was originally called Roswell Junction on the Atlanta-Toccoa Road. Now, Rozell Junction way predates Chambly. I saw a hand coming up.
Yeah, was it ever called the Dumpy?
The Dinky, I think is what you're, and I'll get to the Dinky. Where are we now? Okay, at some point, that same engine is upgraded to a standard gauge. It's been a narrow gauge road, and it was upgraded. Now, I've read that report. I've also read that the Southern Railway replaced it yet again. There is a lot of different conflicting information about this railroad, and you kind of have to sift through all of it, see what seems the most likely and what's the most commonly repeated stories, and hope you got the best of it. All right, here we are passing through Dunwoody, bouncing around, going about 5 miles an hour. It's all rural. Cotton fields and cornfields line the road. So just imagine we're right out here. This could be the Bannister Fields in front of us as the train goes by. Now, once again, this is down at Agwarama, and it is very bouncy. You can tell by how blurry this is. I'm being bounced all over the train. All right, and it's not a fast train. It took about an hour to travel 9.8 miles from Rozell Junction, or Chambly, in 1907, changed to Chambly, up to the south side of the river. And again, you can see about how fast these trains moved.
Now, is that the normal width track by that time?
That's a narrow gauge track there.
Narrow, okay.
And surprisingly irregular. I had no idea how twisty and bumpy it would be. All right, let's follow the track. We're here at the river, and we're going to go from the railroad station. We're going to kind of follow parallel to Rozell Road, climb up this valley at an oblique angle. This is Dunwoody Place. We're going to follow along Dunwoody Place. Here's Coca-Cola right there. Here's the end of Roberts Drive. Roberts used to come across and connect on this side. This followed what was Roberts Road across 400. This is the Northridge exit. Past the elementary school under construction. We get down here and we curve to the right on Spalding to avoid going down this creek shed right here. We follow Spalding, again following a ridge line, the highway, until we reach the beginning of Chambly-Dunwoody Road, and then we follow along this, staying kind of level as much as we can. We don't go all the way to the high point. Reconnect with Roberts. Here's Dunwoody Village, Mount Vernon Highway, coming down Chambly-Dunwoody. Again, we're down here. This is a pretty nice straight run. And as we approach, here's the farm, here we are right here. As we approach this point, we start to curve off to the right, not really on Shallowford Road, but somewhat parallel to Shallowford Road, across 285, down across Nancy Creek, down here at the bottom. There was a mill here at one point, a furniture factory. This was also a watering stop for the train at a certain point, up the valley and on into Chambly. So that's your actual route of travel. Now, around 1902, a spur track was added from the area near the intersection of Spalding and Chambly-Dunwoody roads in order to build a new dam on the Chattahoochee River. And you can see the railroad coming up to the dam right here, still in existence during this picture. Originally built by the Georgia Railway and Power Company, it was developed primarily to power streetcars in Atlanta. Right? That was its original function. And just as the railroads had been built with convict later, so was much of that dam. This 2.75 mile spur had its own 040 engine, to answer your question, called the Dinky. Now, the Dinky is a common term for a small work engine in many yards. So several of my friends and I started chasing, like, what happened to the Dinky? Where is the Dinky? Where is the buck? And we ended up chasing a bunch of blind leads on the Dinky, only to learn, oh, there's a lot of Dinkies around. All right. This one worked just the spur line going off to the dam, except for in 1905, the two engines were combined together to bring Teddy Roosevelt's presidential car for a visit to his mother's home, Bullock Hall in Rozell, Georgia. And here we see Mittie Bullock and her husband, Mr. Roosevelt Sr. And here we see Teddy right here at the Rozell station. Here they are in front of Bullock Hall. Once again, there's Teddy Roosevelt. So who knew that one day Teddy Roosevelt will go right down in front of this house? All right, neither the Buck nor the Dinky had turnarounds, and the nearest roundhouse for the railroads was down in Atlanta. So the engines always faced in one direction. Now, controversy again exists over which way they pointed. Some evidence points facing forwards to go south from Rozell to Chambly and backing its way back to Rozell. And there's other evidence that suggests it went the other way around. And I don't know for sure. I know these pictures like these make it extra confusing because the train, the engine is clearly going towards me because look at the smoke trailing that way. It's pulling the car, but the cars are at the nose of the train. So it didn't matter which way it went. You could pull it or push it. So it's like, I don't know which way they're pointing, but again, notice these cotton fields that it's passing through.
Do we think that that's what happened? Because the engine didn't turn around, but did they put the cars back in the other side?
He could have pulled down into the main line and had cars uphill, if you would, or upline from the switch, brought the cars down in, shuttled them onto this line, and then pulled back in front of them and pushed them.
So we think that the cars were always in the back of the train.
It's not consistent. There's pictures both ways.
Interesting, yeah.
I think it's whatever worked that day, I guess.
Whatever screwed people up.
If we look at Poor's Manual for the Railroads in 1883, it lists one engine, one passenger car, 2 box cars, 1 baggage car, and 4 flat cars. 11 years later in 84, it's got 2 box cars still, no passenger but 1 baggage, etc. I'm not sure what etc. means, car, and 4 flat cars. So I think our passenger usage has declined somewhat. In the 1883 manual, it shows the income as of the end of 1882, roughly about a year after they started operation. They had $2,500 in passengers, $5,900 in freight, $594 in other. I think this is the fees for carrying the mail. It's the best I can determine. So their total income was $8,857. Their expenses were $17,898. Heavy loss there, over $9,000. But of course, those heavy startup costs in that first decade. Back one. And for 1894, their income is $6,900. Expenses still higher, $76,000. And now they're paying interest on the bonds that were issued to pay for the railroad. So their net loss is $2,900. Now, this didn't stop people from trying to build this up and make it more than it had been. This is a Southern Railway plan from 1907 to expand the Rozell station to almost double its size. Now, this construction never actually happened, but it's interesting to look at the details of it. You notice on the front of these stations there were 2 doors. It's because you had a colored waiting room and you had a white waiting room. All right? And a friend of mine did this rendering of that Rozell station. Here would be the river. And this is what that would have like had it ever been built. Ike's house would have been right here. But as it turns out, they never had the money because they kept losing money. So they had plans to make money and grow bigger, but it never quite occurred. Here you can see the front of the building and your white entrance and your colored entrance on the front of it. Now, the railroad, we tend to look back nostalgically at things and kind of think, oh, what a nice old story, but it was a rocky start. From 1863 to 1874, we had the Atlanta and Rozell Railroad Company. Now, they haven't built anything yet. It's just a charter from the state to build a railroad. In 1870, the Atlanta and Richmond Company acquires shares and agrees to help fund construction as they build their own line from Charlotte to Atlanta. And of course, the two are going to join together. Unfortunately, the Atlanta and Richmond runs out of money, and they never pay for the work that's been started on the Rozell Railroad. Consequently, and that work was done by Grant, Alexander and Company. Consequently, here we see in court, Mr. Grant, and actually it turns Grant and Alexander taking the Atlanta and Rozell Railroad Company to court to collect on the contractor's liens of $25,000 that they had not been paid. Unfortunately, in this process, Alexander dies and the company is dissolved, so by the time this gets out of court, this settlement goes to the heirs of Alexander and Company, and then they try to do something with recovering their money. So in 1879 to 1880, the heirs form a new company called the Rozell Railroad Company, Atlanta's left out, in partnership with the successor of the Atlanta-Richmond line, known as the Atlanta and Charlotte Air Line. Now, I've never heard a good explanation of why they called a railway the airline, but it makes it confusing today when we have airlines. They secure a $35,000 mortgage to finish the railway, but before the operations really begin for the Atlanta-Charlotte Airline, the control of the Rozell Railroad is taken over, by the Charlotte Airline. 1884, the Charlotte Airline is acquired by Southern Railways, who operates until the railroads were taken over by the U.S. government during the World War I, who operated it from 1917 to 1919. They felt that it was important to the war effort. I'm not sure quite how they contributed, but they did operate this railroad. When the Southern Company regained control, they decided they'd lost too much money on this line, and they petitioned to shut down the railroad. The Morgan Falls branch had finished its purpose before 1910. It had ceased to function even before the war. But even the scrapping of that line was dogged with squabbles and lawsuits. Here we see a telegram from one of the vice presidents of the Raleigh line talking about, wait, somebody's trying to file an injunction against us taking the railroad for scrap, and please stop the injunction. I mean, it's just a constant struggle the whole life of this railroad. Finally, the bank loan has defaulted, and what we see in 1820 is a receiver is appointed for the railroad company and on behalf of the mortgage company, and then finally the net salvage is a little over $10,000 as they close down the railroad. And
You said 18.
I'm sorry, thank you for correcting me. And so we arrive at the end of our story of the railroad. I'll be glad to answer any questions people might have. Yes, sir.
How deep was the cut that they could put across Mount Vernon Highway? How deep was that cut in just this side of the squirrel house?
I'm going to defer to Michael. Let me introduce my friend Michael Hitt, who probably has done most of this research on the railroad. He's also the guy who developed this map, and Michael probably answers that better than I can.
Well, up in this particular area, you didn't have a big cut, because like he was showing on the ridge line, how the line went, I mean, there's some deep cuts that you can visibly see today. Up here, it's just in the bank, they cut into the embankment, but you're not going to have cuts like on both sides, you know, looking at high embankments and you're cutting through a hill they just cut through. You didn't have any of that around here. Further down the line where the line crossed the Chattahoochee River, in fact, there's an Arby's restaurant overlooking 285 at Chamblee, Dunwoody. And literally, if you go to the Arby's like you're driving around back to the drive-through, when you're right there getting ready to order, which would be on your left, to your right, you just see woods. Well, if you park your car anywhere, but go to that same spot and just look over the embankment where the woods are, you're looking right down on, you can see the cut of the railroad.
But it was deep enough that no bridge was built across. And going south from Mount Vernon, you had to turn at the Squirrel House and go to
Nandina?
the Methodist Church.
Nandina?
Yeah, further to the church on Nancy's Creek, there was a trestle bridge.
I think he's talking about this little jog up here at Nandina Lane where somehow traffic from Mount Vernon, is that right, had to jog to get around the railroad.
Yeah,
I don't think that was as much an elevation issue as I think they were trying to connect with the sawmill that was down there and just route traffic and something a little more normal, but I can't promise I'm right.
There's no deep cuts in that area of the line.
Well, we knew a resident who said she stood on the steps of the old school, the library, and that her head was same level as the engineer of the train.
Yeah, that type level, I'm thinking something much higher, bigger cuts.
But enough so there was no crossing,
Right, yeah,
no road crossing.
exactly, yeah, but there was no bridge, railroad bridging there, and there was no, in that area, they didn't bridge any road bridges. Everything went right over the tracks when they crossed it.
At grade.
Yeah, at grade.
That's because Mount Vernon's on a ridge.
Right.
Trains don't like to go up.
The only bridge crossing I think was the spur line and Rozell Road. The Rozell Road had to jump over the railroad, or is it the other way around?
No, you have it right.
Okay.
You got that on the map.
And Michael has made this wonderful map, same artist that Mr. Perkins' map of the Hightower, right?
Yeah.
Chuck Brown, and he has got copies of this for sale, so feel free afterwards to see Michael if you'd like your own copy. And really, a lot of the same story you've just heard is on that map. So, any other questions?
This is the map that Michael.
It looks just like the one right behind you.
Well, these people in the back can't see it.
There you go. For those of you back there in that corner, Michael's map.
How much are they?
20.
So, suitable for framing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that they had a spur line or not just off of, just to the right of us a little ways? The reason I ask, when I moved there in 1971, there was clearly a path and a area, and I found traces of ties, and I have a couple of railroad spikes.
Now, where is this? There is another spur that he doesn't mention, and I find very little on, but tell me again where you are.
This is just to the right. I live in what's called Village Mill 1, and I back up to the west. I'm at the end of the cul-de-sac.
Right?
In the back of my lawn, there was a cut in the ground about 10 feet wide, fairly flat spot, come down, and it's where they cut the hill off to build the house I live in. And when I moved in it, I found traces just at the property edge of, in that ditch, there were a couple of ties,
Right.
remainders of ties, and I picked up 2 or 3 railroad spikes.
The only other piece I know of, and I only find one mention of it, and I have no idea the path, is a state judge named Samuel Hewitt built his summer home out here on the Chattahoochee River. It's now the National Park headquarters in, what's the name of that? Island Ford Park, yes. That log house there is built out of cypress from the Okefenokee. The judge owned timbering companies in South Georgia, particularly in the Okefenokee, where he harvested that timber, and in the swamp area in a lot of South Georgia, they would build temporary railroads, only be in existence long enough to clear this field of wood, and then they'd move the whole railroad again. There is mention in one source of him building a spur from somewhere to that National Park headquarters now to bring the cypress logs in. And I have to question whether what you're referring to is part of that in some way.
Could it be that the railroad ties were throw-offs from when they were tearing up the railroad? Did they dump them somewhere?
I don't know, but I think they would have salvaged spikes. But you could have lost them. I mean, certainly you could have been careless about it. I have no idea. Can't answer. That's good. Good as theory as any. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What powered the engine?
Steam.
How do they make steam?
By wood. There were stops where the tender behind the engine carried wood, and they had to constantly feed wood into the fire to keep the steam up. And you know, you saw the water tank on some of that video. There were water tanks in Dunwoody and down there by Nancy Creek, out at the Rozell station and then down in the Chambly station to fill the engine back up with water, because you had to feed it not just wood, but you had to keep feeding it water as well. So there's stories of, oh, well, you could go out and wave your handkerchief and stop the train. It's not very likely, because to stop takes a pretty good while, maybe quarter mile, half a mile, and then it takes a lot of steam power to get it going once again. So in talking to the guys who operate the Agwarama Railroad, they said that would be very unlikely that you could just wave it down. It may be that if you're on the far side of Dunwoody and they're coming through, you might say, hey, I need you to stop, but they're probably going to stop anyway because they had to get wood, they had to get water. So
That was kind of my question. Was this a regular stop up here in Dunwoody? Up by the...
There was first the Morgan Falls Junction, then the Dunwoody station, of which there's the workhouse still exists right there next
White
to,
House.
right, the little White House. There were 3 of them at one point. And then they built a station down where Nancy Creek crosses Chambly. There was a station built down there for wood and water, because they got the water from Nancy Creek. They also pumped water up to the main railroad from down there. That was another one of the legal squabbles later on. It's like, who owns that pumping station? Did it belong to this company or to that company? And just another one of the endless squabbles over the railroad. But that was a stop down there as well. And I would imagine the furniture built down at that mill, do you remember his name? That furniture was delivered into Atlanta by the same railroad.
Were southern railroads heavily subsidized as the western railroads?
Yeah.
I'm assuming not, because they bought every other section of land.
Can't answer to that. Really don't know the history of the mechanics of
They got a good
operation.
bit of money from carrying the mail.
Right, I think that's what that
Until
other,
the mail went out, and then they lost all that.
right. And of course, what really killed the railroad more than anything else was the advent of the automobile and better roads in the early 1900s. Yes, sir.
Did Roswell Junction precede Chambly?
Yes, that was its name before it was Chambly.
It was too conflicting with the mail service. You'd have mail going to Rozell Junction, Georgia versus Rozell, Georgia. So they had to get rid of the Rozell Junction name and come up with another one. So that it got renamed.
Chambly, which was a random pick out of the hat by the post office for when they established a post office in Chambly or at Rozell Junction. The post office, no, you'll be called Chambly.
Then we had Chambly Dunwoody Road.
There you go.
Between 1951 and 55, my wife grew up on Mount Vernon.
Yes, sir.
We coded by airmail because I was in Air Force. All my letters came through the Dunwoody train station, because what had previously been the passenger section was the country store. What was the baggage section was the Dunwoody post office.
There you go.
So later, we moved up here after we married, of course, in 1965 at the Chambly First Methodist Church. When you're looking at the church, to the left there's creek, I believe,
Nancy Creek. Yeah,
On the north side of the creek, the tall timber trestle was still standing.
it was.
Kudzu on it, but here was the Dunwoody Railroad, the Rozell Railroad trestle. Now, the last I saw, if you go south around off that high trestle, it went behind the Methodist church.
Right.
Where it came across the creek that comes down and joins that little small creek. The piers, stone piers, were still standing
Yep.
for that creek.
Right. Yes, you're right.
Farther down, the railroad went across Chambly Plaza. I understand, but do not know, that it went right where the old radio shack used to be.
I believe it.
To the shopping center.
Yeah, through the shopping center.
The
Yes.
current shopping center, the old one.
Chambly Plaza.
Yeah, it went right through there.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever hear there was a stop at Peeler? There was no structure but a stop at Peeler.
Never seen anything written on it, but again, there's a lot of conflicting information, and all of it that you can find is scarce. So who knows how much of the history we're missing?
Going by the Southern Railroad records for the line, each year they would print out for the different lines, and the Rozell track is a spur. They have their schedule, which is reprinted on the map here.
Yeah, it's right there.
And you'll see the growth of, first you've only got 3 stops. Then eventually they add another one. Of the 3, or as they increased in all their stops at their height, south of here was a whistle stop. In other words, there evidently was a structure, like Dunwoody had a structure, Shanley's got a structure. Rozell Railroad, that was never in Roswell, has a structure. But further down, they added a whistle stop.
And that's where Buckline Crossing name came from, right out here? Where the
What?
buck line crossed the road?
I'm sure that's probably the source of that. I've never noticed that name before, but that sounds perfect sense.
That's called Buckline Crossing.
Makes perfect sense.
And it used to have a deer on there.
It was above.
So. Yes, sir.
Your digital flybys are great, make it a whole lot easier to see where you're going and everything. That was
Thank you.
Incredible that you had that. You had the rendering of the Roswell station there with Southern Railway attempting to put it in. There was a depot on this side of the shopping center in those yards, wasn't it? Was that?
Yes, there was one about half the size of what was in that rendering.
Okay. There was a small depot in the yard.
Right. Yes, there was, which later became a dairy farm. Or dairy barn, I'm sorry. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you once again for coming, and please see Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Clark. We
Valerie.
appreciate it. We have a little gift from Dunwoody Preservation Trust.
Oh, you're too kind.
Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Let me say one more thing.
Oh, parking information.
Parking.
We're all parked already.
Yeah.
All right, exiting.
Thank you for helping us out with parking. We got 34 cars parked on this space.